There's a single setting sitting inside your irrigation controller right now, the exact one the installer left there on the day it was put in. And that one setting is the reason almost every lawn on your street struggles every single July, no matter how much money the homeowners spend on fertilizer and weed control. It's not a lack of water. Most of these yards are getting plenty of water, sometimes more than they need. The mistake is when and how often that water goes down, and it's baked into the default program almost every irrigation system ships with. My name's Lenny. I've spent the last 20 years walking lawns for a living, and I can tell you almost exactly what a homeowner's watering schedule looks like before they ever tell me, just by looking at the lawn. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what that mistake is, why it's built into your system by default, and the 10-minute fix that changes everything about how your lawn handles heat for the rest of the summer. Here's the mistake in one sentence. Watering a little bit every single day trains your grass to grow roots that only reach an inch or two into the soil, and a lawn with roots that shallow collapses the moment you hit a real heat wave, even if you never missed a single watering day. This happens because of how a plant actually responds to where it finds water. Roots don't grow downward just because gravity exists. They grow toward moisture, following whatever path gives them the easiest access to water. If you water for 15 minutes every evening, that water only ever penetrates the top inch or two of soil before it either evaporates or gets absorbed by the topmost root hairs. The plant has no reason to send roots any deeper because there's never any water waiting for it down there. You end up with a lawn that looks perfectly green on the surface all spring because it's getting watered constantly, but underneath, the entire root system is sitting in a shallow band just below the surface, completely unprepared for the first stretch of 90-degree days without rain. Now here's the part almost nobody realizes, and it's the reason this mistake is so widespread. It's not really the homeowner's fault, at least not at first. Walk out to your irrigation controller and pull up the factory default program, or better yet, check what the installer actually programmed the day your system went in. The overwhelming majority of controllers ship or get installed with a default cycle that runs every zone for a short duration, somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes, every single day or every other day. That default exists because it's the safest setting for a landscaper to leave behind. New sod and freshly seeded lawns genuinely do need frequent light watering to keep the top layer of soil moist while seeds germinate and roots establish. So the installer sets it up that way to protect the new lawn during its first few weeks. And then everybody moves on and nobody ever goes back to change it once the lawn is established. That short daily cycle that was exactly right for week 1 is now running unchanged in July, 2 years later, actively working against the lawn instead of helping it. I've walked into more backyards than I can count where the homeowner swears they've been watering religiously. And they have been, on a schedule that was only ever supposed to last 3 weeks. Let's talk about what the correct approach actually looks like. Because the fix isn't complicated, it's just the opposite of what feels intuitive. The target for most lawns is about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week total, combining rainfall and irrigation, delivered in 1 or 2 deep sessions rather than spread across 7 short ones. Deep, infrequent watering forces the plant to send roots down 4, 5, sometimes 6 inches or more into the soil chasing that moisture, because that's the only place water is consistently available. A lawn with root systems that deep can access soil moisture that a shallow-rooted lawn simply cannot reach, which means during a 2-week dry stretch in August, the deep-rooted lawn is still pulling water from 6 inches down, while the shallow-rooted lawn next door has already burned through everything in the top inch and started going dormant or dying. Same rainfall, same sun exposure, completely different outcome. And the entire difference comes down to root depth, and root depth comes down to watering frequency. Here's exactly how to figure out your own numbers instead of guessing. And this is the same method professional crews use because it actually accounts for your specific soil and sprinkler system instead of a generic rule of thumb. Set out 5 or 6 empty tuna cans scattered across one irrigation zone. Run that zone for exactly 15 minutes. Then take a ruler and measure how much water landed in each can, and average the readings. That average tells you how much water your system delivers in 15 minutes for that particular zone. From there, simple math gets you the rest of the way. If your 15-minute test averaged a 1/4 inch, you know you need roughly 60 minutes of total runtime per week to hit that 1-inch target, split across 2 sessions of 30 minutes each, rather than one long 60-minute soak, because most residential soil can't absorb water fast enough to take a full inch in a single continuous cycle without significant runoff. That brings up the second half of this fix, something called cycle and soak. And it solves a problem almost every homeowner runs into the moment they try to switch from daily short watering to less frequent deep watering. If you have heavy clay soil or any kind of compacted ground, and you try to run a zone for 30 straight minutes, you'll notice water starting to run off into the street or the driveway after the first 8 or 10 minutes, because the surface layer of soil simply can't absorb water that fast. The fix is to break that 30-minute session into 2 or 3 shorter cycles with a rest period in between. Run the zone for 10 minutes. Let it sit for 30 to 60 minutes so the surface layer can absorb what's already there and open up some capacity. Then run it again for another 10 minutes. The first cycle softens and saturates the top layer. The second cycle actually penetrates deeper into the soil instead of running off the surface uselessly. Most modern smart controllers have a cycle and soak feature built directly into their programming menu, but it's almost never turned on by default, because turning it on requires the installer or homeowner to actively go in and set it up, and that step gets skipped constantly. Quick, before I get into timing and the smart controller trap, if you're serious about fixing your lawn without wasting your weekends guessing at settings and products, you need a real plan laid out for you. That's why I wrote the book. A straight step-by-step blueprint to a greener lawn with fewer weeds, exactly what to buy, where to get it, and when to put it down. Scan the QR code or click the link below to grab your copy. Now let's talk about timing, because when you water matters almost as much as how much and how often. The single worst time to run your irrigation is late evening or overnight. And I know that sounds backwards because that's when it's coolest and evaporation loss is lowest. But that's exactly the problem. When you water at 10 or 11 at night, that moisture sits on every single blade of grass for 8, 9, 10 hours straight before sunlight and morning heat finally dry it off. That long, uninterrupted damp window in the dark is precisely the condition fungal diseases like brown patch and dollar spot need to establish and spread. You can be doing everything else right, hitting your total weekly inches, running cycle and soak properly, and still end up with disease pressure simply because your system runs at 9 p.m. instead of 5 a.m. The best window is that early morning stretch, roughly 4 to 8, ideally starting before sunrise. Watering then means the moisture soaks into the soil while temperatures are cool and evaporation loss is minimal, and then the sun comes up a couple hours later and dries the grass blades off, closing that fungal window down to almost nothing. Here's where the smart controller trap comes back in. Because a lot of homeowners assume that spending $300 or $400 on a smart irrigation controller automatically fixes all of this, and it doesn't. Not by itself. These controllers pull local weather data and can adjust run times based on recent rainfall and forecasted heat, which is genuinely useful, but almost every one of them ships from the factory or gets left by the installer on that same short daily default cycle as a starting point. And the weather-based adjustments only scale that existing schedule up or down. If the baseline program is 15 minutes daily, a smart adjustment might bump that to 18 minutes on a hot day or skip a day after rain, but it's still fundamentally running the same shallow, frequent pattern the whole system was built around. You paid $300 for a controller that's smart enough to slightly tweak a bad habit instead of breaking it. The real fix isn't the hardware. It's going into the programming menu yourself, deleting that default daily cycle entirely, and building a new one based on your tuna can numbers with 2 sessions a week and cycle and soak turned on. That's a 15-minute task with the manual in one hand, and it does more for your lawn than any weather sensor upgrade ever will. Let me walk you through what this actually looks like once you make the switch, because the transition period trips people up if they don't know what to expect. Week 1, right after you switch from daily shallow watering to twice-weekly deep watering, don't be surprised if the lawn looks a little more stressed than it did before, especially if it's been running on the old shallow schedule for a long time. The existing root system is shallow, and it takes a few days to start adjusting to the new watering pattern, so there can be a brief dip before things improve. Weeks 2 and 3, this is when you'll start noticing the grass holding its color longer between watering sessions, because roots are actively pushing deeper in search of that less frequent but more substantial moisture. The footprint test is a good way to track this. Walk across the lawn a day or two after a watering session and see how quickly the blades spring back up behind you. As roots get deeper and the plant builds more resilience, that recovery time gets faster and faster. By week 4 to 6, most lawns making this switch show a visibly deeper, more consistent green color. And critically, they hold up noticeably better during the first real heat wave that follows, which is the entire point of this whole exercise. The lawns that skip this switch are the ones you'll see going crispy and brown 2 streets over during that same heat wave, while yours is still holding steady. One more layer to this worth knowing, because the correct schedule isn't identical for every lawn, and applying one blanket number across a whole yard is its own smaller version of the same mistake. Soil type changes how fast water moves through the ground, and that changes how you should be splitting up your sessions. Sandy soil drains fast, water moves through it quickly, and doesn't hold on to moisture very long. So a sandy lawn generally benefits from 3 shorter deep sessions a week rather than 2, because the soil simply can't store a week's worth of moisture in 1 or 2 applications the way heavier soil can. Clay soil sits at the other end of that spectrum. It holds water for a long time once it's actually absorbed, but it's slow to let water in initially, which is exactly why the cycle and soak method matters so much more on clay than it does on sandy ground. If you've got clay, 2 deep sessions a week with cycle and soak breaks built in is usually enough, because the soil is doing a lot of the moisture retention work for you between waterings. Loam, which is the middle ground most suburban topsoil actually falls into, generally does fine with the standard 2-session approach without much modification. The quickest way to figure out which category your yard falls into without sending soil off to a lab is to grab a handful of moist soil from a few inches down and squeeze it in your fist. Sandy soil falls apart the second you open your hand and won't hold a shape at all. Clay soil forms a dense, slick ball that holds together even when you poke at it. Loam holds a loose shape but crumbles apart with a little pressure. That 30-second test tells you which end of the schedule to lean toward before you ever touch the controller. I want to be straight about why nobody tells you this when they install your system. And it's not some grand conspiracy against homeowners. It's just how the incentive structure works in that industry. An irrigation company gets paid to install the system and get it running correctly for new sod or seed, and their liability concern in those first few weeks is a lawn that dies from underwatering, not a lawn that develops shallow roots 2 years down the road. Coming back out to reprogram your controller for long-term root health isn't a billable service most companies offer, and there's no follow-up call scheduled for month 6 to check whether your default settings still make sense. The system gets installed, the invoice gets paid, and the responsibility for updating that program as the lawn matures quietly becomes yours. Except nobody actually tells you that's now your job. There's one more myth worth clearing up before we get to the weekend plan, because it's the thing that keeps people stuck on the daily short cycle. Even after they've heard all of this, a lot of homeowners assume that watering less often automatically means their lawn is going to look stressed or thirsty in between sessions, and that fear alone keeps them running the sprinklers every single evening just to be safe. Here's what actually happens once a lawn transitions to a deep, infrequent schedule, and the root system has had a few weeks to adjust. The soil at 4 to 6 inches down holds moisture far longer than the top inch ever could, simply because it's shielded from surface evaporation and sun exposure. A well-established, deep-rooted lawn can comfortably go 5, 6, sometimes 7 days between waterings in moderate summer weather without showing any visible stress, because the roots are pulling from a reserve the shallow-rooted version of that same lawn never had access to. The visible stress people are afraid of, the wilting, the dull color, almost always shows up in lawns that never made the transition in the first place, the ones still running on that daily 15-minute default with roots stuck an inch below the surface. The fear of underwatering by switching to a less frequent schedule is really just fear built from experience with a shallow root system, and it mostly disappears once the roots actually get the chance to grow into the deeper, more reliable moisture zone. This whole method is designed to create. Walk out to your irrigation controller and write down exactly what's currently programmed for every zone, the runtime and the days of the week. Then grab 5 or 6 empty tuna cans, run one zone for 15 minutes, and measure what actually lands in each can to get your real delivery rate instead of guessing. Use that number to calculate how long each zone needs to run to hit about 1 to 1.5 inches per week, and split that total across 2 sessions instead of daily short bursts. If you've got compacted or clay-heavy soil and you notice runoff during testing, turn on Cycle and Soak in your controller's menu and break each session into 2 or 3 shorter cycles with a rest period between them. Move every start time to somewhere between 4 and 8 in the morning if it isn't already there, and mark your calendar to check back in on the footprint test in about 3 weeks, because that's roughly when you'll start seeing the difference between a lawn with roots reaching down 6 inches and every other lawn on the street still running on a default program nobody ever went back to fix. That's the entire mistake, and it costs you nothing to correct beyond about 15 minutes with your controller's manual and a handful of tuna cans. Thanks a lot for watching, and let me know in the comments what your current watering schedule looks like. I'd bet a good number of you are running that same daily default without realizing it. Now, if you're serious about fixing your lawn without wasting more money guessing at settings and products, you need the right plan. My book appearing on your screen right now is a straight step-by-step blueprint to a greener lawn with fewer weeds, exactly what to buy, where to get it, and when to put it down. Scan the QR code or click the link below to get your copy, or head over to fixyourlawnin30days.com to get the lawn you deserve. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.